The wind once moved through the mountains like a language only the stones could understand. It carried with it the breath of ages, thin, cold, and laced with the dust of forgotten lives. There were no cities here, no walls or roads, only ridges veiled in snow and valleys carved by glaciers older than memory. It was a world suspended between silence and survival, and yet someone once called it home. Long before written names or maps, when the sky was sharper and the stars felt nearer, these highlands belonged to beings whose story almost vanished into the ice. Their fires flickered in caves that would one day be buried. Their voices softened into the echoing drip of meltwater. The mountains did not yield easily to life. They were the kind of places that broke the unprepared, where lungs fought for air and nights could freeze the marrow. But for 200,000 years, through storm and frost, one branch of humanity endured here. The Denisovans. No one alive ever saw them, and yet traces of their presence linger, hidden in the quiet architecture of living bodies. Their story was almost erased, not by violence but by time's slow erosion. It was as if the mountains themselves guarded their memory, keeping them secret until the right moment. And when that secret was finally disturbed, it came not with thunder or discovery, but with a single bone. A fragment of a girl's finger, small enough to fit inside a vial, light enough to tip the balance of everything we thought we knew about ourselves. But before the scientists, before the microscopes and headlines, there was only this, the breathless stillness of a plateau high above the clouds. It was a world that tested the limits of endurance. The thin air pressed against the lungs like an invisible hand, and yet there were fires here, proof of persistence, of warmth wrestled from a merciless landscape. The mountains, austere and unyielding, were alive with subtle motion. Mist coiled around the ridges at dawn, freezing into crystals that glittered like powdered glass. Herds of mammoth and woolly rhino once wandered these slopes, scraping frost from the earth. The wind whistled through the stones, shaping them into whispers, and among those whispers, footfalls, deliberate, patient, and enduring. They belonged to the Denisovans, a people shaped by the cold, tempered by altitude, and bound to this high world as intimately as roots to the soil. In their time, the earth's rhythms were slower, heavier. Seasons dragged like breaths through frostbitten lungs. Summers were brief, cruel flashes of green before winter reclaimed the world. But in that brief window, life pulsed fiercely. Streams thawed, valleys bloomed with tundra flowers, and the air smelled faintly of lichen and smoke. It was during these fleeting seasons that they thrived. Building, hunting, gathering, carving tools from stone that gleamed in the firelight. Theirs was not a kingdom of conquest, but of endurance. They ruled no empires, but they mastered something rarer, the art of survival in places where even light seemed fragile. And though they left no monuments, the evidence of their dominion lay in their adaptation. They lived where others could not breathe. They endured where others would have perished. It was the kind of mastery that left no mark on the landscape, yet etched itself into the deep record of human inheritance. For when their kind was gone, their gift remained, hidden in the code of those who followed. Somewhere, far in the future, their breath would mingle with ours, carried forward invisibly through the veins of their descendants. But back then, their world was immediate. It was the hiss of snow against the cave mouth, the taste of ash and marrow, the orange pulse of a flame reflected in eyes that had seen centuries of ice. They had no reason to believe they were anything other than the world itself, creatures of the mountain, bound to its breath and silence. And perhaps in a way they were. The cave that would one day bear their name, Denisova, sat like a wound in the hillside, dark, deep, and waiting. For millennia, it cradled the remains of lives that passed through its stone embrace. The walls absorbed the smoke of countless fires. Bones lay scattered in its soil, mingled with those of animals long extinct. And outside, the wind continued its patient song, sculpting the cliffs into shapes that no longer matched any living memory. In the stillness of those nights, stars glowed like cold embers. The sky stretched vast and indifferent, but the people below were not afraid of the dark. To them, the night was a familiar companion, an old rhythm of silence and flame. They learned the constellations not through names, but through repetition, the steady rising and setting, the slow wheel of time. There was mystery in their existence, even to themselves. They had no mirrors, no histories written in symbols, yet their world was full of meaning. The curve of a mammoth's tusk, the texture of stone, the scent of pine resin. These were their lexicons. Their survival was a conversation between flesh and environment, body and mountain. They listened to the earth, and in return, the earth allowed them to remain. But the question lingers: how did they thrive where so many others would falter? The answer lies not only in biology, but in something more elusive: an unspoken harmony with hardship. The mountains demanded humility, and they gave it. Every breath was an act of negotiation, every heartbeat a quiet defiance of the cold. They became part of the altitude, not its victims. Even now, when modern climbers ascend to those same heights, burdened by gear and oxygen masks, they struggle against limits the Denisovans once moved through with ease. Their bodies, shaped by generations of adaptation, carried within them a secret resilience, a biological poetry written in their blood. They were not guests in that realm of stone and sky. They were its children. If one could have stood among them, listening to the faint rhythm of their camp, there would have been no sense of awe, only familiarity, the crackle of a fire, the quiet conversation of hands working flint, the soft breathing of children huddled against the cold. They were not heroic. They were ordinary within their extraordinary world. And perhaps that is the most humbling truth, that what we see as impossible was, for them, simply life. Time passed differently in those heights. Centuries might drift like snowflakes, indistinguishable one from another. Generations were buried beneath layers of dust and frost, their stories compressed into silence. But even silence preserves, in that stillness, the essence of their existence endured, waiting for someone someday to listen again. And so, when the first fragment of their world was uncovered, a sliver of bone no longer than a breath, it was as if the mountain itself exhaled. After 200 millennia, the silence broke and the forgotten were remembered. Science gave them a name, but names are shallow things compared to the immensity of time. The mountain had always known them, even when we did not. They were not conquerors, nor were they ghosts. They were a reminder of what humanity has always been: fragile, enduring, and endlessly curious. The mountains that once tested them now stand as their monument, not in grandeur, but in endurance. Somewhere, beneath the snow and stone, the wind still carries their whispers, not words, but impressions. The echo of footsteps, the sigh of breath, the faint heartbeat of survival against the odds. And if one listens closely enough, in that thin, breathless air, it might seem as though the mountains themselves are remembering, telling, softly, of a people who lived here once, who dared to call this desolation home. For 200,000 years, they walked between sky and earth, between fragility and strength. And though the world changed, though ice gave way to forests and forests to men, their story never truly ended. It lingered, waiting, patient as stone, for the moment it would be heard again. Long before the world took the shape we know, before roads and borders, before names clung to rivers or peaks, there existed a silence so complete that even time seemed to hesitate. The earth was younger then, not by years, but by its pulse. Seasons moved slowly, heavy with ice. The northern continents were dressed in white, their veins of stone hidden beneath vast frozen skins. In Siberia, winter was not a season but a state of being. The wind moved endlessly across the plains, brushing against skeletal trees that whispered and bowed. The land stretched outward without horizon, pale and endless. Each dawn arrived reluctantly, filtering through curtains of mist, casting a dull silver light over everything it touched. Beneath that light, shadows of ancient creatures wandered. Mammoths sweeping snow aside with their tusks, herds of steppe bison trudging through drifts that reached their flanks. The ground itself seemed to sigh with their passing, as though the earth remembered every footprint. Farther south, the Altai Mountains rose like a memory of the planet's bones, ridges torn from the deep, thrust upward by the slow breathing of the earth. They stood between worlds, east and west, steppe and forest, ice and sun. Their slopes gleamed under frost. Their valleys carried the smell of pine and stone. The peaks caught the clouds, sheathing themselves in storms that lasted for days. Tibet, too, lay in that ancient cold. High and still, its plateaus were vast mirrors reflecting the thin light of distant suns. Here the air was thinner than song. The world shrank to essentials: stone, wind, and will. Those who walked here walked within a silence so profound it seemed to echo. Yet even in that silence, life persisted. Blue sheep balanced on cliffs. Birds traced invisible paths across the pale sky. And somewhere, unseen, the ancestors of humanity were learning to endure. It was an age when the earth spoke only in elements: frost and thaw, hunger and fire. Every breath was a fragile victory. And within that endless struggle, a few small lights flickered. Campfires in caves, brief sanctuaries from the cold. Those fires belonged to beings both familiar and unknown. The Denisova cave, though it did not yet bear that name, already waited. It lay cradled in the limestone of the Altai, its mouth opening toward a valley that was half forest, half steppe. From the outside it looked ordinary, a shadow beneath a ledge, another hollow carved by water and time. But inside the air was ancient. The walls bore the marks of countless seasons, soot, dust, and the faint glitter of mineral veins. To step inside was to step between epochs. For tens of thousands of years, creatures sought shelter there. Hyenas, bears, wolves, and eventually people. Layer upon layer of existence settled into the soil, pressed down by centuries until each stratum became a page in the slow book of time. Ice sealed it, dust covered it, and the cave waited, silent and patient, for its story to be uncovered. When the first scientists arrived there, they did not yet know what they were about to disturb. To them, it was another site among many, a place that promised Neanderthal tools or the bones of Ice Age fauna. They set up their tents near the entrance, their breath clouding in the chill morning air. Shovels and brushes replaced claws and fangs as the instruments of excavation. The ground that had been frozen for millennia yielded reluctantly, each layer a whisper from a vanished world. What they found at first were the ordinary relics of deep time. Fragments of stone tools, bits of charcoal, bones gnawed by predators. Nothing remarkable, nothing that hinted at revolution. But then, deeper in the strata, embedded in the permafrost, they uncovered something smaller, delicate enough to overlook, yet powerful enough to rewrite the map of human history. It was a finger bone. Just a fragment, really. Smooth, pale, unassuming. It might have belonged to a child, and in a sense, it did. A girl who had lived and died in that cave more than 40,000 years ago. Her remains had lain undisturbed beneath layers of ice and dust, untouched by the chaos of the modern world. She had no name, but she would become a bridge between epochs. The scientists, cautious and meticulous, catalogued it, unsure of its significance. Bones were common in such sites. This one was fragile but not unusual, yet something about it lingered in their minds. Perhaps the precision of its preservation, or the quiet dignity of its placement. Months later, when the sample was sent to a lab in Leipzig for genetic sequencing, the true magnitude of the discovery began to unfold. The DNA was unlike any they had seen. It was not fully Neanderthal, nor fully human. It was something else, a lineage both familiar and alien, branching off from the family tree of humanity like a ghost limb. And with that revelation, the silence of the mountains fractured. But in that moment, when the bone first saw light after tens of millennia of darkness, there was no announcement, no thunder of revelation, only the soft crunch of gravel, the murmur of wind through the trees, and the quiet realization that something extraordinary had been sleeping beneath their feet. Outside the cave, the world was much the same as it had been in the girls' time. The same winds traced the same ridges, the same rivers cut through the valleys. The mountains, indifferent to the passage of years, watched as humans came and went, building civilizations, drawing borders, forgetting. To them, 40,000 years was a breath. Inside the cave, though, time pooled like water. Every particle of dust carried a fragment of story. Every layer of sediment held a memory, the ash of a fire, the tooth of a predator, the flint that once sparked light. It was all there, compressed beneath ice, waiting for someone to listen. The contrasts were everywhere. The fragility of bone against the endurance of stone. The brevity of a human life beside the permanence of mountains. Yet it was that very fragility that allowed continuity. The finger bone, so small it could rest on a palm, had outlasted empires. The girl's genetic echo would outlast even the cave itself, carried forward invisibly through time. When the researchers finally understood what they had found, wonder outweighed shock. They stood at the threshold of the cave, breathing the cold air, aware that beneath their boots lay the footprints of beings whose existence had gone unimagined. They were scientists, but in that moment they were also witnesses, not to discovery, but to remembrance. The Denisovans, that was the name given later, borrowed from the cave, not the people. Names were for our convenience, not theirs. To the mountains they were simply life, another rhythm in the long heartbeat of the earth. The revelation spread quietly through the scientific world, like light diffusing through ice. Each new test, each comparison, each cross-referenced genome confirmed it. This was no mere variation, no anomaly. It was evidence of an entire lineage of humans, one that had endured across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, leaving traces in the genes of modern people from Tibet to Oceania. The cave, once a forgotten hollow, became a threshold to deep time. Excavations revealed ornaments made of ivory, tools shaped with skill, and even hints of pigment. This was not a place of mere survival. It was a home. Each artifact whispered of thought and purpose, of adaptation and art. And yet, even as science illuminated their existence, mystery deepened. How far had they spread? What songs had they sung? What did they see when they looked across those endless valleys of snow? No one could say. The answers were frozen beneath layers yet unexamined, beneath centuries still sealed in ice. Outside, the Altai wind still moved through the pines. Snow gathered at the cave's lip, softening its outline. The sun, low and pale, turned the mountains gold for a fleeting moment before retreating again. And somewhere within that frozen quiet, the echoes remained, not just of one girl, but of an entire people whose lives had been folded into the fabric of the earth. The world would come to know them only through fragments, through traces written in bloodlines and stone. But their story was larger than discovery, larger even than science. It was a reminder that beneath every surface lies another, older truth, one that waits patiently for light. The cave still breathes. In winter, its air is colder than the skin of the mountain. In summer, it exhales mist that smells faintly of earth and age. To stand there now is to feel both presence and absence, the weight of time pressing from every side. And if one listens long enough, the wind outside begins to sound like a voice. Not human, not divine, but eternal. It asks a question that lingers, even as the sun fades behind the peaks. What kind of humans were these mountain dwellers? And what do their echoes still remember that we have forgotten? From the quiet soil of a single cave came a whisper that reached across the world. It was a whisper carried not by sound, but by sequence. 4 billion letters of code written in a language older than speech. When scientists first read it, they realized they were not just looking into a fragment of bone, but into a forgotten mirror of humanity. The Denisovans were never meant to be found. Their story was folded deep within time, their faces dissolved by millennia of frost and dust. No skulls bore their likeness. No carvings told their tales. They existed as a ghost lineage, an invisible branch on the human tree, unseen but ever present. And yet, when the strands of their DNA were uncoiled and read, a pattern emerged, delicate and undeniable. It was as though time itself had exhaled, allowing the past to breathe again. They were kin to the Neanderthals, sharing with them a distant ancestor that lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. Together, they had diverged from the lineage that would become us, Homo sapiens, in a slow, patient unraveling of evolution. The Denisovans took their own path eastward, into Asia's vast and formidable landscapes. While Neanderthals adapted to the cold plains of Europe, the Denisovans vanished into the mountains and forests, where clouds touched the ground and the stars seemed close enough to reach. Science tells their story in sequences and data, in charts that trace lines of descent, but numbers alone cannot capture what it meant to live and breathe in those days, to stand beneath the aurora and feel the wind slip like glass across the skin. Theirs was not an abstract existence. It was hunger and warmth, danger and endurance. It was life, immediate and tangible. In the glow of their fires, the Denisovans must have looked much like us. Broad-faced, strong and deliberate in movement, hands calloused from stone and bone, their eyes catching the flicker of flame, reflecting light that reached forward through time to touch our own. In that reflection lies the paradox. They are both us and not us, both lost and eternal. In the laboratories where their genomes were read, scientists described them in cautious language. They spoke of divergence, admixture, and haplotypes, but beneath the technical phrasing ran a current of awe. How could so much be known from so little? From a sliver of finger bone and a fragment of molar came a map of kinship that spanned continents. Each nucleotide was a syllable in a story no one had realized existed. The story of a people who walked through the shadowlands of history, leaving no monuments but themselves. They were the hidden architects of human diversity, shaping not civilization, but the quiet resilience within it. In their genes lay adaptations to cold, to thin air, to survival at the edge of what the human body could bear. It is easy, from the distance of modern time, to imagine them as primitive. But such a word means nothing in the face of endurance. In the Altai, as night fell and the mountains darkened, perhaps a Denisovan mother knelt beside her child, showing him how to coax a spark from flint. The air was thick with wood smoke and the faint sweetness of pine resin. Her hands moved with certainty, guiding his smaller ones, the rhythm of the action older than memory. When the first ember caught, a thin thread of flame rose, trembling. The boy's face lit in orange and gold. Around them, the cave walls flickered, alive with moving shadows that looked like ghosts, but were only reflections. A family of light and stone. That scene could have belonged to any age, any people, but in it lies the essence of what connects us. The fire's warmth was the same we seek, the fear of dark, the same we know, the tenderness of teaching, the same we still share. Across 200,000 years, the gesture survives. They did not see themselves as exceptional. They were simply part of the living world, hunters, gatherers, makers. Their tools, found beside their bones, were sharp and efficient, shaped with quiet mastery. Their ornaments, simple yet deliberate, hinted at an aesthetic sense, the human desire to make beauty even in desolation. They worked with what the land offered: ivory, stone, sinew, and time. To imagine them is to imagine humanity before boundaries, before names divided us. There were only landscapes and lives intertwined within them. The Denisovans breathed the same air as the mammoths they hunted, drank from the same frozen rivers, watched the same constellations. Their world was vast but intimate, harsh yet strangely whole. And then they were gone. Not vanished in an instant, not erased by catastrophe, but slowly absorbed, like ink fading into parchment. They merged, intertwined, dissolved into other branches of humanity. Neanderthals, sapiens, wanderers from the south and west, all met, exchanged not only tools and fire, but blood. From those quiet unions came descendants who carried forward their essence, unknowingly. That is how ghosts survive, not in memory, but in marrow. When geneticists traced the DNA of modern peoples, they found echoes of the Denisovans not in Europe where their cave was found, but thousands of miles away, in the high plateaus of Tibet, in the islands of Melanesia, and across the scattered archipelagos of Southeast Asia. It was as though their spirit had followed the mountains and seas, finding refuge in distant bloodlines. Among the Tibetans, a single gene stood out, EPAS1, the adaptation that allows them to breathe easily in the thin air of the Himalayas. It was Denisovan in origin, a gift passed down through generations, carried quietly through millennia, a whisper of ancient lungs still expanding at high altitude. The mountains remembered them, and so did the blood of those who walked there now. In Melanesia, too, their mark persisted. In the skin, in the immune systems tuned by ancient struggle, in the subtle architecture of life itself. The Denisovans had vanished as a people, yet they endured as inheritance. They had become the unseen ancestors of millions, their story written not on stone, but in the code of being. It is tempting to think of them as shadows, but perhaps it is we who are the ephemeral ones. They lived closer to the elements, more honestly tethered to the earth. Their days were measured not by hours, but by survival, their nights by the fire's radius of light. They needed no history, because they were part of one too vast to name. In laboratories, fluorescent lights hum softly as researchers study fragments of their genome. On monitors, sequences scroll like ancient script. A few milligrams of dust hold the weight of an entire civilization's absence. The scientists speak in hushed tones, not because of reverence, but because discovery itself demands quiet. Somewhere between code and consciousness, the Denisovans emerge again, a pattern of life rediscovered. And yet, even with all we know, they remain unknowable. No artist can sketch their faces with certainty. No language can echo their speech. We can only reconstruct outlines, a jaw, a tooth, a whisper of presence. They slip between categories, between the visible and the forgotten, between what science measures and what imagination must restore. They are the ghost lineage that refuses to vanish. The unseen relatives who remind us that the story of humanity is not a straight line, but a web woven through time, tangled, resilient, alive. When the mountain winds rise over the Altai, they pass through the same valleys where those fires once burned. The soil still holds the warmth of their hands, though faintly. The air still carries their breath, dispersed but not lost. And within the hearts and blood of millions of living people, their rhythm continues. The child whose finger bone was found, may have looked into the flames of her own small fire, her reflection dancing in the light, unaware that she would one day bridge the world's forgotten kinships. She was not a relic, she was a continuation. In that knowledge lies the gentlest truth, that no life is ever truly gone. It transforms, merges, adapts. The Denisovans are gone, and yet they are here, not in form, but in essence, in the lungs that draw high mountain air, in the warmth of human skin against cold, in the endless inheritance of endurance. They remain within us, quiet and unseen, a lineage that once walked between ice and sky, now living in every breath taken by those who remember without knowing why. High above the tree line, where clouds skim the peaks and the air thins into near nothingness, the world grows quiet. Sound travels differently there, thinner, more fragile, as though the sky itself resists the weight of a voice. Even today, those who climb into the realm of snow and stone feel the air retreat from them. Each breath becomes a negotiation, each step a test. The lungs strain, the heart races, and the horizon trembles in the thin light. Yet there was once a kind of human who did not struggle here. Where modern explorers gasp and stumble, they walked with calm rhythm. Their hearts did not pound in panic. Their breaths came smooth and sure. The thin air that humbles most creatures seemed to welcome them. It was as though the mountains had made a pact with their blood. These were the Denisovans, ancient dwellers of altitude, shaped not only by endurance, but by evolution's quiet craftsmanship. Their mastery of the high world was not built of tools or technology, but of molecules, the intricate chemistry of survival. At the heart of that mystery lies a single gene, EPAS1. Within its small, spiral script rests one of the rarest adaptations ever written into human life: the ability to thrive where oxygen barely clings to the wind. Modern physiology teaches that at high altitudes the body begins to fail. Oxygen, the invisible fuel of existence, grows scarce. The air pressure drops, the lungs can no longer draw in enough, and the blood thickens in its desperation to compensate. Many who climb the Himalayas describe the feeling not as exhaustion, but as drowning in open air, a suffocating silence that tightens with every heartbeat. But the Denisovans were different. Their bodies knew the altitude as a home, not a hazard. The gene they carried fine-tuned the balance between oxygen and blood, between heart and mountain. Instead of overproducing red blood cells, which can clog and collapse the system, their bodies remained calm, efficient, serene. Their blood flowed like clear rivers through frozen valleys. It is a marvel, an adaptation not born of willpower, but of time's invisible artistry. Somewhere in their long sojourn among the peaks, evolution sculpted this gift. Generation after generation, those whose bodies could listen to the mountain's thin breath endured. Their children inherited that harmony until it became a defining note of who they were. Scientists today trace that adaptation in the DNA of modern Tibetans, a faint echo of Denisovan resilience carried across the millennia. When tested, their blood reveals the same rare sequence, the same subtle efficiency. It is as if the mountains, once the Denisovans' domain, passed on their secret through these descendants, whispering it down through the ages. Breathe slowly, but surely. To stand at those heights now, with lungs burning and pulse unsteady, is to understand just how extraordinary that gift was. The wind that brushes across the Himalayan plateaus carries little air, but much history. The peaks, vast and luminous, bear silent witness to those who once walked their ridges without fear. They would have moved like shadows among the snowfields, neither conquerors nor trespassers, but kin to the altitude itself. The question, of course, lingers like frost. How? How did evolution, in its slow, blind patience, carve such precision? How did mere chance yield this balance of life and air, this perfect equilibrium between body and sky? Science offers its explanation, steady and measured. Over hundreds of thousands of years, as Denisovans spread through the highlands of Central Asia, those who carried the advantageous genes survived more easily. Natural selection, that quiet, impartial force, favored their breath, their blood, their still hearts. It was not a miracle, but it feels like one. For what else is evolution, if not nature's way of remembering what works? Imagine them there, a small group of Denisovans gathered around a fire at 14,000 feet. The night has settled, sharp and star-crowded. The flames tremble in the thin air, but they persist. Around them, the mountains rise like the spines of sleeping giants. And beyond, the moon spreads its pale silver across the snow. One of them lifts a hand toward the stars, not to reach them, but to feel their distance. His chest expands easily, his lungs full and steady. He breathes without strain, without awareness of privilege. To him, the mountain is not an adversary. It is home. In the dark beyond their firelight, the world is silent, but alive. The shifting of snow, the creak of ice, the occasional cry of a distant creature adapted to this same rare air. Their hearts beat in unison with that vast, cold rhythm. Every breath they draw seems to echo the pulse of the planet itself. When modern climbers speak of the death zone, they mean altitudes where oxygen becomes too scarce to sustain ordinary life. But for the Denisovans, there was no such boundary. The so-called death zone was their living room. Their bodies were shaped not for sea-level comfort, but for sky-level survival. It is humbling to consider that somewhere in our blood, their legacy endures. In the genes of the Tibetan herder, walking his yaks across a glacial pass, in the lungs of a Sherpa guiding climbers to the summit, the Denisovans breathe again. Their adaptation, ancient, unintentional, miraculous, lives on, sustaining lives that would otherwise falter. There is poetry in this continuity, a lineage lost to history still saving lives in silence. The mountain wind that once brushed against their faces now touches those of their distant kin. It is continuity disguised as coincidence. Scientists examining the EPAS1 gene describe it in technical terms: transcription factors, hypoxia pathways, hemoglobin regulation. But beneath the jargon lies a story of connection, of inheritance written in code instead of words. Evolution, in this sense, is a storyteller far older and wiser than us. It writes not in ink, but in oxygen and blood. The Denisovans never knew the meaning of adaptation. They did not think of genes or advantage. They simply lived. And in living, they became one with the conditions that would terrify others. Their children's children inherited that ease, until it became as natural as the wind that swept across their faces. There is something serene in imagining them, not as survivors of adversity, but as companions to it. They did not conquer the mountain, they coexisted with it. Their lives were measured not by altitude gained, but by equilibrium maintained. Their hearts beat slowly, their breaths shallow and sure. In that rhythm was peace, and perhaps that is what true survival means. Not dominance, but balance. The more we learn about them, the clearer it becomes that their story was not one of struggle, but of harmony. Where modern humans fight the cold, the thin air, the relentless climb, the Denisovans had already become part of the landscape. The mountain's difficulty was their normalcy. The hardship we romanticize was their everyday rhythm. To them, the cold was a texture, the thin air a taste. The stars above were familiar companions, not distant ideals. When they rested, their bodies recovered easily. When they dreamed, they breathed softly, never gasping for life. Today, in the labs where their genetic code is studied, glowing screens display their ancient sequence. Patterns of adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine. From that pattern emerges not just data, but identity. Every highlighted strand tells of adaptation so complete it borders on art. Scientists trace the Denisovan variant of EPAS1 in Tibetans and find it unmistakable. The same gene that once steadied a heart beneath the stars now steadies another high above the same clouds. And yet, even this remarkable inheritance cannot fully bridge the distance between past and present. The Denisovans' mastery of altitude was more than biological. It was spiritual, in the way that survival often is. To live in constant proximity to the sky is to develop a certain reverence, not worship, but respect. The mountain teaches humility with every breath it withholds. In that way, the Denisovans were not just adapted, they were attuned. Their existence was an ancient accord between creature and environment, written in air so thin it could barely hold sound. At times, modern life feels like an attempt to return to that kind of belonging, to find again that effortless accord between body and world. We build machines to measure oxygen, to regulate temperature, to simulate the conditions they endured naturally. But the truth is simpler and more haunting. Once, humanity had already reached perfect balance with one of Earth's harshest realms, and then it was gone. When the sun rose over the high plateaus, the Denisovans would have watched the light spill over the peaks, turning the snow into gold. Their breath misted briefly, then vanished into the vast blue air. They would have stretched, spoken softly, resumed their daily rhythm, the quiet industry of life continuing against the stillness of eternity. They did not know that they were performing miracles. To them, survival was ordinary. To us, it is legend, and though their bones have vanished, their lungs remain, in us, in others, in the high-altitude dwellers who still walk where they once walked. Every Tibetan breath is an ancient inheritance. every steady heartbeat under the thin sky a continuation of their grace. The mountains remember them not as strangers, but as kin. When the wind brushes the prayer flags at 15,000 feet, carrying their colours across the horizon, perhaps it carries their memory too, not as an echo, but as breath. And so the legacy of the Denisovans endures, not carved in stone, but written in air, in the silent exchange between blood and altitude, a whisper of oxygen, a quiet defiance of fragility, a testament that once humanity belonged even to the thinnest of heavens. In the deep silence of the mountains, where daylight struggled to touch the earth and the cold reigned without mercy, the Denisovans built small sanctuaries of warmth and light. Fire, fragile, flickering, alive, was their constant companion. It was not merely a tool, nor even a comfort, but a heartbeat. Against the vast indifference of the frozen world, that orange pulse defined the rhythm of their days and nights. Imagine a cave at dusk. Outside, the wind claws at the stone, carrying with it fine snow and the distant cry of some unseen creature. Inside, shadows move against the walls, alive with the restless shimmer of firelight. A handful of Denisovans, perhaps a family, perhaps a cluster of wanderers, sit close together, the heat of the flames softening the numbness in their fingers. The air smells of smoke, earth, and animal fat. Sparks rise and vanish into the dark ceiling like small souls escaping. Around them lie the relics of endurance, flint shards, bone awls, simple tools made with practiced precision. The rhythm of survival was not hurried. Each cut of stone, each stroke of flint was deliberate, almost meditative. In their world, patience was not a virtue, it was necessity. Archaeologists would one day uncover fragments of this life. Carefully flaked stone blades, shaped in ways both familiar and distinct. The workmanship spoke of intelligence and attention, a mind comfortable with repetition and refinement. Among the bones of hunted animals, researchers found signs of butchery, fire marks, cracked marrow, evidence of meals shared long before history began keeping records. But beyond those physical traces lies the invisible world of their daily existence. The Denisovans, unlike us, did not divide time into minutes or days. Their hours were measured by hunger and warmth, by the cycle of the hunt and the return to firelight. Theirs was a rhythm older than language, a quiet choreography of necessity and care. When the storms came, and they always came, the caves became worlds unto themselves. The walls glittered faintly with moisture, and the sound of the wind outside was like a giant breathing. Inside, they would cluster near the flames, their bodies forming a circle of protection. Children pressed close to mothers, learning by imitation how to hold a flint, how to feed a fire without smothering it, how to listen to the snow for the sound of movement. Some nights, the fire burned low, and the only light came from embers. The orange glow would paint their faces, catching in the curve of a cheek or the glint of an eye. In that stillness, they were more than survivalists. They were a community, small, fragile, yet bound by an intimacy the modern world can scarcely imagine. The mountains demanded silence, but within that silence, they found a kind of companionship. Their laughter, soft, quick, swallowed by the thick air, echoed against stone and was gone. Yet for a moment, it filled the cave like music. It is tempting to think of them as isolated, but isolation is a modern fear. For the Denisovans, solitude was the shape of existence, not its flaw. They lived within it as easily as they breathed the thin air. The mountains were vast, yes, but they were not empty. There were tracks in the snow, the passage of deer, wolves, perhaps other groups of humans. Occasionally paths might cross, and with them stories, gestures, exchanges too subtle to leave fossilized remains. Even in the heart of such remoteness, there was art in the ordinary. The simple act of lighting a fire was a ceremony, a spark born of flint striking stone, the brief glow of tinder catching, the first thin flame trembling in the cold air. All of it a moment of creation, repeated countless times, never losing its quiet wonder. The smell of smoke was the smell of safety. It marked the boundary between danger and belonging. In its warmth, stories were likely told, not in words we could ever translate, but in gestures, in rhythms, in the universal language of shared memory. A hunter might trace the shape of a mammoth in the air, recalling the chase. A child might mimic the call of a bird, prompting laughter. The cave walls, rough and unmarked, listened and kept their secrets. Their tools, though simple, carried a refinement that spoke of lineage. Knowledge passed hand to hand. To shape stone in the flicker of firelight required both patience and trust in tradition, each edge cut sharper than the last, each motion repeated until it became instinct. The Denisovans' world was built on such repetitions, not invention in leaps, but in quiet increments, guided by observation and the steady hand of survival. In the deep winter months, when snow sealed the entrances and the cold pressed hard against the rock, they must have felt the weight of stillness. Yet even then, life persisted in small acts. The tending of embers, the mending of furs, the sharing of food, scraped from bone. Their world was austere but not joyless. Warmth was a communal act, and fire, once lit, belonged to all. Archaeological layers tell of their meals: charred bones of deer and horse, the cracked remains of marrow feasts, fragments of burned wood. These were not signs of struggle, but of order, evidence of a people who understood their environment intimately. Every fire left a mark, every tool a signature. Among the most haunting discoveries are the ornaments. Small, drilled beads made from animal teeth or ivory. They are evidence of something beyond survival, the human impulse toward beauty. Perhaps these ornaments were tokens, gifts exchanged between kin, or charms to keep away the cold spirits of the mountains. Whatever their meaning, they prove that even in the harshest conditions, the Denisovans sought to express something inward, something sacred. The firelight would have caught those beads, making them shimmer faintly against fur and skin. Such small adornments must have felt like fragments of sunlight carried into the dark. Psychologists speak of the effects of isolation, how loneliness gnaws at the human spirit. But for the Denisovans, solitude was never loneliness. It was the backdrop against which connection shone brighter. In a world of vast spaces and long silences, every touch, every shared breath near the flames, carried immense weight. The intimacy of their communities, small, interdependent, bound by trust, was their truest technology. Imagine a night deep in winter. The blizzard has howled for hours, turning the entrance of the cave into a frozen curtain. Inside, a few embers still glow. A woman stirs them carefully, coaxing one last spark into life. The flame flares weakly, then steadies. Around her, others sleep, their breaths soft, synchronized, peaceful. She watches the light play over their faces and smiles faintly. Outside, the world is an ocean of white and wind, but in here there is warmth. The mountain, for all its cruelty, cannot touch them. Such moments, invisible in the fossil record, are the truest measure of their humanity. It was not the tools or the hunts that defined them, but the care with which they built life against indifference. The mountains they called home were full of danger: avalanches, predators, the constant threat of starvation. And yet for 200,000 years they persisted. That longevity speaks not of mere survival, but of adaptation through cooperation. The warmth of fire was nothing compared to the warmth of kinship. When the morning came, pale and cold, the Denisovans would emerge from their caves to a world glittering with frost. The snow, unbroken except for their footprints, stretched to the horizon. The sky above, so clear it hurt to look at, seemed eternal. They would shoulder their tools, adjust their furs, and begin again. The endless rhythm of existence, repeated with grace. Though their words are lost, the mountains still carry their presence. The stones remember their touch. The caves still echo faintly with the ghosts of their laughter. In the stillness of those high plateaus, when the wind moves just right, it sounds almost like breath, a whisper of lives once lived in firelight. And perhaps that is their true legacy. Not the bones in the ground, nor the genes in our blood, but the reminder that warmth, even in the coldest world, begins in the act of gathering together. The Denisovans are gone, but their story remains in the embers, the soft glow that refuses to fade, the eternal flame of humanity burning quietly against the dark. There are moments in prehistory when the lines between species blur, not in fossils or DNA charts, but in firelight. When night fell over the old world, and the air cooled to silver stillness, three kinds of humans sometimes shared the same horizon: Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early Homo sapiens, separate yet familiar. Each carried their own way of being human, their own rhythm of breath and memory. For hundreds of thousands of years, they lived in partial isolation. Neanderthals across the forests and plains of Europe, Denisovans among the icy mountains of Asia, and the first modern humans still finding their way out of Africa. But isolation was never complete. The earth has always conspired to bring wanderers together. It is easy to imagine these meetings as violent, as clashes over territory or prey. Yet the evidence, whispered through genomes rather than words, tells another story. The crossings between these peoples were not written in battle scars, but in the soft language of intimacy. When scientists sequenced the ancient DNA from Denisova cave, they uncovered traces of intermingling, strands of genetic memory that spoke of contact, cooperation, and kinship. The discovery of Denisova 11, a single bone fragment no larger than a coin, changed the way we understood those encounters. Hidden in the darkness of the cave, her remains told a story that transcended species boundaries. She was the child of two worlds, her mother a Neanderthal, her father a Denisovan. In her, the ancient divides dissolved. The world she lived in must have been cold and uncertain, yet her existence itself was proof of connection. Two distant branches of humanity, each molded by their own landscapes, met and mingled, not through conquest, but through something quieter. Curiosity, attraction, necessity, or perhaps love. In the flickering half-light of a shared fire, one can imagine the scene. A Neanderthal group, their heavy brows and strong hands marked by the western plains, encountering a small band of Denisovans who moved with mountain steadiness. Words might not have passed easily between them. Language, if it existed, would have been limited, gestures crude. But the eyes, the face, the tilt of a head, those are languages older than speech. A hand offering food or fire. A moment of recognition. You are not me, and yet you are. Perhaps they traded tools, learned each other's sounds, watched how the other struck sparks or shaped stone. Perhaps a child laughed, and in that laughter, something ancient softened. A reminder that even across species, tenderness survives. The mountains do not remember the details. They keep no record of those nights. But in our blood, the memory remains. Fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA live within modern humans today. Faint, persistent echoes of those shared moments. The fact that we carry their sequences means they were not isolated by hatred or fear, but connected by proximity and need. Where Neanderthals brought the strength of the plains, the Denisovans brought the calm endurance of altitude. Together, they must have shared skills, instincts, and stories carved from their landscapes. Cooperation was not ideology, it was survival. Modern science, cautious and precise, uses the language of gene flow. It sounds clinical, mechanical. Yet behind that phrase lies something tender. Encounters between strangers who recognized each other as something more than beasts. A hand brushing against another in the cold, a shared shelter against the storm, breath mingling in the dark. And so, the boundaries between them softened, not through conquest, but through compassion. It was a quiet revolution, one that did not seek to dominate the earth, but to understand it through one another. The Denisovans and Neanderthals were not mirror images. They differed in appearance, voice, perhaps even scent. Yet their differences were never absolute. In the hybrid child's bones, science found not the end of a lineage, but the proof of a web, a network of connections spanning time and terrain. Humanity, it turns out, has never been a tree with separate branches, but a river delta, ever dividing and rejoining. Imagine the cave once more, the fire burning low, casting red light on rough stone. Two figures sit near it, one broader, with the strong build of a Neanderthal, the other leaner, their face lit by the calm gaze of a Denisovan. The silence between them is not emptiness, but understanding. In that space, they are not species, but souls. The world outside is vast and merciless, but here, for a moment, there is warmth. Perhaps they spoke softly, sharing the rhythm of their breath with the rhythm of the flame. Perhaps they did not speak at all. Communication does not always require words. The language of survival, of presence, is older, simpler, and infinitely deeper. When Homo sapiens finally entered the scene, wandering northward into Denisovan and Neanderthal lands, the pattern continued. Genetic evidence shows that our own ancestors, too, met and mingled with both these older peoples. The traces remain inside us, not as impurities, but as inheritance. In every human alive today outside Africa, there are fragments of Neanderthal DNA. In many across Asia and Oceania, there are Denisovan threads as well. Our species did not replace them cleanly, like one light extinguishing another. Instead, the torches were shared, their flames merging until they became inseparable. The modern human genome is a tapestry woven from encounters that blurred the line between self and other. We carry their gifts, the Denisovan genes that let Tibetans breathe at impossible heights, the Neanderthal variants that shaped our skin and immune systems. Their legacies live not in museums but in us, when we breathe deeply, when our hearts steady under cold wind, When we look up at the stars and feel ancient recognition, we are remembering them. To think of our origins as a single story is comforting, but false. The truth is richer, messier, more human. We are not descendants of one line, but inheritors of many, of wanderers who met and mingled beneath the same moon we see tonight. Our species was never alone. It was born from meeting, not from isolation. The hybrid child from Denisova Cave, Denisova 11, is perhaps the most beautiful symbol of that truth. Her bones do not belong to one people or another. They belong to all who ever reached across difference. She stands as a silent monument to connection, a testament that the human story is not one of walls, but of bridges. In the quiet of the cave where she once lived, the air must have carried the scent of smoke and earth. The sound of water dripping from stalactites echoed through the dark. Perhaps she played near the fire, her laughter mingling with voices that carried traces of two worlds. No one there thought of her as a hybrid, a symbol, or a boundary. She was simply a child, small, curious, alive. And in that ordinariness lies the extraordinary. The meeting of species did not happen as an event, but as a life. One breath at a time, one gesture at a time. It was not a clash of civilizations, but a quiet merging of hopes, fears, and blood. When the mountains fell silent again and the millennia passed, the fire went out. The people were gone, but the air, the stone, and the genes remembered. And now, when scientists peer through microscopes and see those sequences intertwined, they are not witnessing a mystery of biology. They are witnessing an act of connection older than language. The story of the Denisovans, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens is not one of extinction, but of exchange. Each left something behind in the others, a molecule, a memory, a mark of shared existence. Competition and cooperation have always danced together in evolution's long rhythm. But here, in this corner of time, cooperation seems to have won. Not through conquest, but through communion. Not through fear, but through the gentle courage of approach. We like to think of humanity as singular, one kind of being, one unbroken lineage. But perhaps it was never so. Perhaps to be human has always meant to carry others within us, to be, in some quiet sense, plural. In the mingling of bloodlines, the lighting of shared fires, the passing of genes across borders long forgotten, we find not confusion, but completion. The story of life is not purity, it is blending. When the wind moves through the Altai Mountains today, brushing past the entrance of Denisova Cave, it carries not the memory of one people, but of many. The echoes overlap. Neanderthal, Denisovan, human. A chorus of voices that once sang softly beneath the same roof of stone. We are their continuation. In every breath we carry their meeting forward, the union of differences that became our shared inheritance. Humanity then was never a single note. It has always been a harmony, fragile, fleeting, but achingly beautiful. There comes a point in every story when the fire burns low. The shadows lengthen, the voices grow quiet, and the night folds gently over what was once alive. For the Denisovans, that moment came slowly, not with cataclysm or conquest, but with the soft inevitability of change. Their world, the cold altitudes, the endless plains, the deep caves, began to shift. The ice retreated, then advanced again. The great glaciers moved like patient gods, carving valleys, swallowing forests, erasing the familiar. Seasons grew harsher, then uncertain. The air itself seemed to lose its rhythm. To the Denisovans, change was nothing new. They had endured it for hundreds of millennia. They had seen rivers freeze and thaw, herds migrate and vanish, the stars wheel endlessly above. Yet even their quiet resilience had limits. Some changes come too swiftly or too subtly to be met by endurance alone. The mountains that had sheltered them for so long began to betray their silence. Food grew scarce. Herds wandered elsewhere, following the warmer winds. The firelight in the caves burned less often, and the echoes faded from the stone. No one knows exactly how the Denisovans disappeared. There was no final battle, no apocalyptic end. Their vanishing was not an event, but a gradual fading, like footprints filling with snow, like a melody that lingers for a moment after the last note. Somewhere in the long cold twilight of the Pleistocene, they began to merge with the others, Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and with the land itself. What was once distinct began to blur. Their faces, their voices, their gestures were absorbed into those of others until no line could be drawn between them. The archaeologists who sift through the layers of Denisova Cave find the traces of many fires, one above another, each layer a century, 1,000 years, a lifetime. The youngest layers grow thin. The charcoal dwindles, the tools become fewer. Then silence. What happened in that silence? Was it hunger? Disease? The slow isolation of shrinking populations scattered across vast, unforgiving terrain? Or was it love? The merging of their kind with ours until there was no longer a difference worth naming? Science offers theories. Climate models speak of glacial advance and retreat. Geneticists trace how the Denisovan lineage faded into our own through admixture, their separate identity dissolving like snow into a river. But the truth, as always, resists simplicity. In the language of nature, extinction is rarely abrupt. It is a translation, not a termination. The Denisovans may not have perished at all. They may have transformed, their essence carried forward in the breath and blood of others. And yet the silence remains heavy. For a people who once thrived in the breathless heights, to fade so completely is both haunting and humbling. It is as though the mountains themselves swallowed their memory, tucking it away beneath the ice for safekeeping. Imagine the final generations, fewer in number, still lighting fires against the cold. The familiar paths growing empty, the hunts more desperate. The old stories told in softer tones, as though afraid to disturb the quiet that was gathering at the edges of the world. Children born into thinner bands of kin, their laughter echoing in caves that had grown too large. Perhaps one evening, a small group stood outside their shelter, watching the sky. The sunset burned deep red across the horizon, and for a moment, the peaks glowed as if aflame. The air was still. The smell of smoke lingered faintly. One of them looked back toward the cave, the old home, the old warmth, and then forward, toward the endless expanse. There was nowhere left to go, and yet they went. Such moments, though imagined, feel real because they mirror the rhythm of all life, the coming, the flourishing, the fading. In their disappearance, the Denisovans became part of that universal pulse. The same quiet surrender that turns leaves to soil, glaciers to rivers, and stars to ash. There is beauty in that impermanence. It is not failure, but fulfillment. To exist at all, to breathe the thin air of the world for 200,000 years, is to have already defied extinction's certainty. Scientists who study their remnants speak in cautious tones. Perhaps, they say, the Denisovans didn't vanish. Perhaps they became us. In the DNA of modern peoples from Tibet to Papua New Guinea, Denisovan fragments endure, whispers of their endurance folded into our cells, the genes that allow highlanders to breathe, the variants that shaped our immune defenses. These are their fingerprints, still pressing gently against time. It is strange comfort that even in disappearance they found a kind of immortality. Still, one wonders about their final days. What were the last words spoken in the last Denisovan firelight? Did they know they were the last? Or did they, like all creatures, simply live, unaware that their line was thinning, that history was folding quietly around them? Perhaps their fading was not tragedy, but completion. The mountains had taught them to move slowly, to endure, to let go. They must have watched glaciers recede and return, the earth shift beneath their feet. They knew the language of impermanence long before we gave it names. The cold wind that once carried their breath now moves across empty ridges. The snow that covered their footprints melts into rivers that still flow today. In every drop of that water there is memory, not of individuals but of persistence, of how life reshapes itself endlessly, even in the face of loss. Extinction, after all, is a word of human invention. Nature does not think in terms of endings. It only transforms. So when we speak of the Denisovans' disappearance, perhaps what we really mean is that they crossed a threshold, from being to becoming, from presence to memory. The fire in their caves burned low, but its warmth continues in us. Their breath, once visible in the mountain air, has mingled with our own. Every inhalation we take carries a trace of theirs. In this sense, the Denisovans are not gone. They are diffused, their existence no longer confined to bone or cave, but scattered across the living world like ash after flame. The poet in science might say that they completed the circle, returning to the world they once shaped, their legacy invisible yet eternal. To look upon the mountains now, the same ridges, the same frozen plateaus, is to look upon their resting place and their resurrection both. Beneath the snow lies the dust of their fires, above it the breath of their descendants. The wind that moves through the Altai still hums with faint memory. It slips through the caves like an echo of voices, not words, but presence. If you stand quietly enough, you can almost hear it. The sound of a fire going out, followed by the deeper silence that comes not from absence, but from completion. There is melancholy in that image, yes, but also grace. The Denisovans remind us that to fade is not to fail. To be forgotten by name is not to vanish in truth. Their story lingers in the weave of existence, in the soft inheritance of breath, in the quiet continuity that binds all living things. When researchers unearth their bones, they often speak of ghost DNA. But ghosts are only the form memory takes when we refuse to let go. The Denisovans do not haunt the world. They inhabit it. Every cell that carries their genes is a continuation, not an echo. And yet, there is still something haunting about the emptiness of their caves. The tools abandoned, the ashes undisturbed. These relics, fragile and few, speak more powerfully than any monument. They remind us that permanence is an illusion, that all greatness returns to dust, and that dust itself is holy. One can imagine the last Denisovan fire, its smoke rising into the cold air, curling upward toward the stars. Perhaps it burned longer than usual, as if reluctant to die. The embers glowed deep red, then dimmed, then disappeared. Above them, the night stretched vast and indifferent. But somewhere, far away, another fire burned. In another cave, another heart, another lineage. In that continuity lies the answer to the mystery. The Denisovans did not end. They dispersed. They are not extinct, but expanded, carried by those who came after, their essence woven into the great, unfinished story of humanity. And so, when we ask why they vanished, perhaps the question itself is wrong. They did not vanish, they became. Their story reminds us that impermanence is not loss, but transformation, that endings are another form of beginning. The glaciers melt, the footprints fade, the campfires turn to ash, and from that ash, life begins again. The Denisovans breathe their last high in the thin air of the mountains, but their breath continues through ours. The world moves forward, carrying their silence like a sacred echo, and somewhere, in that vast, invisible inheritance, their memory still glows, faint as an ember, eternal as the wind. Far from the cold silence of the Altai Mountains, another kind of light burns, bright, electric, constant. In clean laboratories lined with glass and steel, modern humans bend over their instruments, listening for echoes that cannot be heard by ear. They are searching not in caves or bones, but within the hidden depths of living flesh. The code that remembers what history forgot. It begins, as so many rediscoveries do, with dust, a fragment of bone no thicker than a finger, found deep inside Denisova Cave, carried within it the map of an entire people. Under microscopes glowing a sterile blue, scientists extracted strands of DNA older than any known story, fragile filaments that had slept for tens of thousands of years in the frozen dark. When they sequenced those fragments, arranging their nucleotides like beads on an invisible string, something astonishing appeared. The pattern did not match Neanderthal, nor did it match modern human. It was another voice in the genetic choir, familiar yet distinct. The Denisovans, once no more than a whisper in the fossil record, had spoken again, not through bone or tool, but through the secret language of cells. In the hum of machines, in the quiet clatter of keys and the glow of screens, the mountains returned. Data became landscape. The spirals of DNA unfolded like valleys and ridges, each curve telling of breath and endurance, of lives lived in the thin air of the world. Scientists talk of genomes with a calm reverence. They speak of base pairs, mutations, and markers. But what they are really tracing are ghosts, the unseen presence of those who shaped us before memory began. In one laboratory in Leipzig, another in Beijing, another in California, samples hum under cold fluorescent lights. The air smells faintly of ethanol and paper. Screens flicker with sequences of letters, A, T, G, C, an alphabet older than any tongue. Somewhere amid those millions of lines, a Denisovan's life is encoded. How they breathed, how they adapted, how they endured. It is strange poetry, a ghost story told in molecules. When the first complete Denisovan genome was published, the results rippled through science like the shock of rediscovered kin. It revealed that their DNA survives not in fossils alone, but in us. In the highlands of Tibet and Nepal, in the islands of Melanesia, in the blood of peoples scattered across Southeast Asia, small but significant fragments of Denisovan code persist. Reminders that the past is never truly past. These fragments do not lie dormant. They act, shaping the body's responses to the world. Some regulate how oxygen is carried through the blood, the same EPAS1 gene that lets Tibetan herders live and laugh at altitudes that leave others gasping. Others influence how we metabolize fats, fight infection, even respond to sunlight. In these ways, The Denisovans continue to live through us, not as memories, but as functions, instincts, quiet efficiencies of survival. Their legacy hums beneath the surface of every heartbeat. The contrast is profound. The frozen stillness of their caves, the warm hum of modern laboratories. One world lit by firelight and breath, the other by circuitry and code. And yet both worlds are bound by the same question. Who are we, and where do we come from? Inside the lab, a researcher watches as ancient DNA sequences align on the screen. The letters scroll endlessly, black on white, until a pattern appears, a sequence found only in populations living at great heights. She leans closer, tracing it with her eyes. It is the Denisovan signature. The same sequence once drawn by wind and blood, now drawn in pixels. She pauses. For a moment, the sterile lab feels vast, as though the mountain air itself has seeped into it. The hum of the freezer sounds like wind through stone. In her mind, she can almost see them. The ancient people who once walked where the air is thin, and the stars feel close enough to touch. Science often seeks to separate emotion from discovery, but sometimes wonder is the only honest reaction. To hold in one's hands a molecule that once lived in another species of human is to hold a piece of time itself. It is to touch a silence that predates language. Each DNA strand, when unwound, stretches nearly 2 meters in length, and yet within it are written 200,000 years of adaptation, migration, and survival. The Denisovans' story, long hidden beneath the ice, has now re-emerged in the warmth of our breath. What is most haunting is not how much we have learned about them, but how much of them remains in us. Every gene that aids our lungs, every enzyme that strengthens our blood against the thin air, every subtle shift in our metabolism. These are echoes of the high mountains, carried within. The scientists who decoded their genome often describe feeling a quiet intimacy with their subject. One researcher called it meeting a relative we never knew we had. Another described it as a ghost stepping out of data. Yet the Denisovans are not spectres haunting our lineage. They are its foundation. Without them, parts of us would not exist. And so, in the soft glow of the laboratory, ancient humanity reawakens. Not in bones, but in algorithms. The flicker of computer screens replaces the flicker of cave fires, but the story they tell is the same. Survival, connection, memory. Outside, the modern world hums, cities full of electric light and artificial warmth. Yet somewhere beneath that hum, the same biological music plays. DNA replicating, cells dividing, the old rhythm of life continuing unbroken. Every breath we take, even here, even now, is orchestrated by genes whose origins stretch back to those high-altitude wanderers. In that sense, the Denisovans are not lost. They are hidden in plain sight. They live in our blood chemistry, in the shape of our skulls, in the small biological advantages that kept our species alive through ice and famine. They are the unseen architects of our endurance. It is humbling that so much of what we call human is in truth a mosaic of many humanities. Neanderthal, Denisovan, Homo sapiens, once divided by geography and adaptation, now fused in every one of us. The genome is not a record of purity, but of blending. It is a family portrait drawn in invisible ink. In a sense, the labs of today are mirrors of the caves of yesterday. Both hold the same elements: darkness, curiosity, light coaxed from fragility. The scientist's pipette is the descendant of the Denisovan's flint. Both are tools for understanding the world, and when the researcher peers through a microscope, she too is peering into firelight, searching for meaning in patterns she cannot fully see. The geneticists speak of ancient admixture events, but the phrase is too cold for what it describes. It was life meeting life. The Denisovan DNA within us is not a remnant. It is a relationship. It is evidence that, long ago, humanity learned to merge instead of merely compete, and so the laboratory becomes a kind of temple. The hum of machines becomes a chant. Every sequence added to the database is another verse in the long hymn of existence. In the soft light of monitors, the past shimmers like a reflection in water, fleeting yet undeniable. There is poetry in the precision of it. That after all these millennia, the Denisovans' survival depends not on their own fires, but on ours, the electric fire of inquiry, the luminous persistence of curiosity. When night falls outside the research centers, the rooms remain lit. Screens glow, centrifuges spin, freezers hum. The same patience that once shaped flint now guides algorithms. The same wonder that once stared into the stars now stares into code. In this new world, discovery itself becomes a form of remembrance. To sequence is to listen, to lean close to the whispering genome and hear, beneath the static, the old mountain wind. And what that wind says is simple: we are still here. For though the Denisovans' caves have fallen silent, their genes speak through every person who carries a trace of them. In the calm pulse of a Tibetan heart at 14,000 feet, in the resilience of islanders who thrive beneath equatorial suns. Their legacy is not a ghost story told to frighten or mourn, but one told to remind that no life vanishes entirely. It changes form, moves forward, inhabits new bodies, new voices. In the hush between breaths, the Denisovans remain, not as relics, but as rhythm. The same rhythm that keeps our lungs expanding in the thin air, our hearts steady beneath the weight of sky. Their whispers have become our breath, and so, in the end, the hum of modern science and the silence of ancient mountains are one and the same. Two expressions of the same wonder, separated by time, but united in purpose. The cave fire and the microscope's glow both seek to illuminate the darkness, to remember what the world once held. The Denisovans never truly vanished. They became invisible in the most profound way, woven into the very fabric of our existence. Every heartbeat at high altitude, every steady breath in the cold, every pulse of endurance beneath the stars carries their song forward. They are no longer seen in the caves of the Altai, but they remain in the quiet harmony of our blood. Genetic ghosts, yes, but ghosts that breathe. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all, that long after their fires died, the Denisovans found a way to keep living, not in stone or bone, but in us. There is something the mountains try to tell us, something that cannot be written in stone or measured in carbon. It drifts instead through the air, caught between silence and echo. It is a lesson older than language, older even than our species, that to endure does not mean to conquer, and to survive does not mean to rule. The Denisovans understood this truth, though they never wrote it down. They lived it. In their long vigil above the clouds, they practiced the art of quiet endurance, a life balanced between the fragility of breath and the immensity of the earth. For 200,000 years, their world was not one of empires or inventions. It was a rhythm, slow and sure, the crackle of fire, the crunch of snow, the endless heartbeat of wind against stone. They did not tame the mountains. They belonged to them, and perhaps that is why they lasted so long. In the soft imagination of their existence lies a mirror to our own. We, who have filled the planet with noise and light, often forget the patience that once kept our ancestors alive. We imagine survival as struggle, endurance as victory. Yet the Denisovans remind us that there is another kind of strength, one that rests not in domination, but in harmony. The mountains they called home remain the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Altitude strips the air of its richness. The cold gnaws at bone and thought. Yet within that harshness lies clarity. Every sound becomes sacred. Every breath becomes an act of faith. To walk through that world, whether 50,000 years ago or today, is to confront one's limits. The thin air humbles the lungs, the silence humbles the mind. And in that humility, something awakens. An awareness that we are small, but not alone. The Denisovans, dwelling in their high shelters, likely knew that feeling well. The stars would have seemed close enough to touch, the valleys below an ocean of mist. In such a place, life must have felt both fragile and infinite. Every day a negotiation between endurance and surrender. From that quiet dialogue between body and mountain, a philosophy was born, though not in words. It was written instead, in adaptation, in breath, in the genetic melody that still sings inside us. The Denisovans did not overcome their environment. They became part of its rhythm. And when we climb those same mountains now, it is their song that steadies our hearts. It is tempting, from our vantage in modernity, to see them as primitive, as incomplete. But what if their way of life held a kind of wisdom that we, in our restlessness, have lost? They moved slowly because the world demanded it. They lived close to fire and stone because the cold permitted nothing else. Yet in that simplicity lay a profound intimacy with the earth, an understanding that survival is not a race, but a relationship. The lesson of the Denisovans is not only genetic, it is spiritual. They remind us that endurance does not come from strength alone. It comes from listening to the body, to the weather, to the quiet shifts of the land. It is the wisdom of the patient, the humble, the adaptable. When modern climbers ascend into those same altitudes, they carry with them oxygen tanks, synthetic gear, and carefully measured supplies. The Denisovans carried only what they could make and what they could remember, and still, they thrived. Their survival was not a triumph of technology, but of belonging. Imagine them now, small groups huddled around fires, faces lit by orange glow. Outside, the wind moves through the passes like a whispering sea. Inside, warmth gathers. Children press close to their parents. The cave walls flicker with shadow and light, like old memories dancing. They were isolated, yes, but not alone. They were quiet, but not forgotten. The mountains held them. And in return, they honored the mountains, through their patience, through their persistence, through their willingness to live within the limits of what was given. There is a kind of peace in such existence. Modern life fears silence. It fills every pause with motion and noise. But the Denisovans' world was made of silence, and it did not frighten them. The hush between the wind's sighs was not emptiness. It was fullness, waiting to be heard. Perhaps that is the greatest contrast between their age and ours. We seek meaning in progress. They found it in presence. To listen to their story now, in the calm before sleep, is to feel that same presence unfold again. The air thins, the pulse slows, the boundaries between time and self blur. We begin to remember what the body already knows, that life's endurance lies not in defiance of nature, but in rhythm with it. The Denisovans teach us that fragility and persistence are not opposites. A flame can be delicate and still burn for thousands of nights. A people can vanish and still endure in the breath of their descendants. Their disappearance was not failure, it was transformation. Even in their fading, they offered something timeless, a fragment of resilience passed down through blood and breath, hidden in the genome's quiet music. Their story hums beneath the static of modern life, a reminder that adaptation is not about conquest, but listening. And so, as science deciphers their code and maps their genes, philosophy must interpret their silence. The question is not simply how they survived, but what they understood about survival. Perhaps they knew that permanence is an illusion, that the mountain itself will someday crumble, that even stone is impermanent, and yet within that awareness, they found peace. To live each day as if it might be the last was not despair, it was gratitude. It is easy to imagine them watching the sunrise over frozen ridges, the sky bleeding from black to gold, and feeling no need to name or own it. The world was vast, and they were small, but their smallness was not insignificance, it was belonging. In that belonging lies a truth that humankind, for all its progress, continues to forget. The earth does not yield to us, we yield to it. The wind that once brushed the Denisovans' faces still brushes ours. The stars they looked upon are the same. The air that filled their lungs moves now through our own. The continuity is not just physical, it is emotional. The same awe, the same yearning for warmth, the same wonder at the vastness of the night all remain. In remembering them, we remember ourselves. If there is fear in this, fear of isolation, of vanishing, of being forgotten, it is a fear they too must have felt. But where we meet such fear with noise and denial, they met it with stillness. The mountains offered no comfort, yet they did not resist them. They made peace with solitude. It takes courage to live in a world that does not notice you. Yet that is what they did, for millennia. Their existence teaches that even quiet lives can echo forever. When we look back at their story, it is not only history we see, but a kind of instruction. a meditation on what it means to last, not as conquerors, but as participants in the long conversation between life and landscape. The mountains remain, carved by wind and time, their slopes holding the same cold breath that once carried the Denisovans' songs. Each gust is a reminder that endurance is not noise, but balance, a steady rhythm against the chaos of change. And when the night grows still, when even the hum of our machines fades, perhaps we can hear it again, the whisper that crosses ages. Adapt, but do not forget. Breathe, but do not rush. Belong, but do not cling. It is a lullaby written in altitude and patience, in genes and silence. The same lullaby that once soothed the Denisovans beneath their starlit sky now hums softly within us, a reminder that resilience can be gentle. In the end, their greatest legacy is not the gene that helped us breathe or the artifacts left in the caves, but the philosophy their existence implies. That strength is not resistance, but accord. The mountains endure because they yield to time. The Denisovans endured because they yielded to life. And we too might endure, not by standing apart from the world, but by kneeling before it, listening as they once did, to the quiet, eternal whisper of the mountains. Night has returned to the mountains, the same night that once watched over them, the Denisovans. Stretches its long shadow again across the ridges and valleys. The wind moves like memory through the stone, tracing paths that no longer know footsteps. Stars scatter across the thin sky, cold and near, their light falling gently upon the same plateaus where fires once glowed and voices once murmured in the dark. The world has changed 1,000 times since then, but the mountains do not forget. They hold memory differently, not in words, not in bone, but in silence. The echo of breath, the shape of a hearth blackened by smoke, the faintest impression of a hand against stone, all remain, folded into time's slow rhythm. Perhaps if one could listen closely enough, the wind itself would tell the story. It would speak of figures moving through snowdrifts, wrapped in furs, carrying embers cupped between their palms. It would speak of small fires lit in great cold, of families huddled together beneath stars too bright to look at for long. It would speak of the Denisovans, a people who once belonged utterly to this high, breathless world. They are gone, and yet not gone. Their bones are dust, their voices lost to air. But in the quiet machinery of our cells, they endure, a secret inheritance, written in the same script that writes the colour of our eyes and the rhythm of our hearts. Every breath taken in the high mountains, every heartbeat steady against the weight of sky, carries the faint echo of their adaptation. Every step through snow, every gaze into distant stars, rekindles what they once lived and knew. They remind us that memory does not always need consciousness. Sometimes it is enough for the body to remember, for the pulse itself to carry the song forward. In the hush of this final night, we can imagine them one last time. A small fire crackles in the mouth of a cave. Sparks rise, carried upward by the thin air, vanishing into darkness. A mother hums softly to her child. The flames paint the stone in gold and shadow. Outside, snow drifts quietly, reshaping the world inch by inch. There are no words, only rhythm. The flicker of light, the slow breath of sleep, the ancient harmony between life and silence. This is how they endured, not through monument or conquest, but through attention, through the quiet art of existing within the world's limits. They did not dream of escape, but of continuation. They found meaning not in change, but in presence. And so, when we speak their name, Denisovans, it is less a name than a resonance, a sound shaped by wonder and grief, by gratitude and humility, for they lived where we can barely breathe. They thrived where most life faltered. They vanished without leaving stories, and yet their story has become ours. The paradox remains, forgotten by history, remembered by the body. Gone from the world, alive in the genome, the mountains lost their footsteps, but not their essence. The echo still lingers. Perhaps that is the lesson the earth keeps trying to teach us, that survival is not the triumph of the loudest, but the persistence of the quiet. The Denisovans are proof that being unseen does not mean being erased. Sometimes the smallest ember burns the longest. Even now, when scientists extract fragments of DNA from the soil of their caves, they are not merely collecting data, they are listening. Each molecule carries a syllable of a language older than words, a record of how life learned to endure. The Denisovans speak through that molecular murmur, not in sound, but in sequence. And when we breathe, they breathe with us. High above, the stars shimmer like frost. Their light has traveled for tens of thousands of years. The same span of time that separates us from them. To look upward is to look backward. The photons striking our eyes tonight left their sources when the Denisovans were still alive, when fires still burned against cave walls, when laughter still mingled with the wind. In that light, they have never truly vanished. The mountains too seem to understand. Their slopes carry the memory of seasons beyond counting. Glaciers come and go, carving stories no one reads. Forests rise, fall, and rise again. And through it all, the peaks remain, watching, patient, indifferent, yet intimate. The same stones that touched Denisovan hands still feel the same cold, the same starlight. The world is vast, but continuity hides in its smallest gestures. The echo of their existence travels not only through genetics, but through feeling, through that quiet awe that mountains awaken in us. When we stand on a high ridge and feel the thin air in our lungs, we share something with them, a recognition that to be alive here is both miracle and burden, a reminder that endurance always begins with breath. Perhaps that is why the mountains draw us still. Climbers, wanderers, dreamers. Somewhere deep inside, we are answering an ancient call, a call carried in our blood, older than civilization. It is the same whisper that once guided the Denisovans across frozen passes. Come, see how small you are and how infinite the world can be. To listen to that call is to touch the same mystery they once lived. The paradox of fragility and strength, solitude and belonging, disappearance and legacy. The night deepens. The stars wheel slowly. The wind hums through stone. Everything that was still is, though changed. The fires are gone, but the warmth remains. The people are gone, but the breath endures. In time, even our own civilizations will pass into quietness. The cities we build will erode. The lights we kindle will fade. Yet something of us will remain too, a trace in the air, in the earth, perhaps in the blood of whatever comes next. This is the cycle the Denisovans already knew. Nothing lasts forever, and therefore, everything matters. Theirs was not a story of conquest, but of continuity, not of noise, but of resonance. In learning to survive the cold, they also learned to let go, to live fully in the space between struggle and surrender. That is the peace they offer us now, in these final moments before sleep. The peace of knowing that to vanish is not to end, that we too will someday become echoes, and that those echoes will still matter. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them. Faint, steady, patient, not words, not voices, but the rhythm beneath everything that lives. The sound of breath meeting air, the eternal conversation between life and the world that holds it. The wind moves again through the passes, tracing invisible spirals over snow and stone. It carries with it the scent of ice, the memory of fires, the sigh of generations. It does not mourn, it remembers. And in that remembrance, the Denisovans live, not as fossils or theories, but as presence, as warmth, as a reminder that we too are threads in the same vast tapestry. Perhaps the mountains remember them still, the warmth of their fires, the rhythm of their hearts. Perhaps when the sun sets behind the peaks and the air turns thin and silver, their laughter stirs faintly in the wind, and perhaps that is enough. For in the end, history is not a record to be completed, but a melody to be continued. The Denisovans began a verse we now carry forward, breathing their harmony into every exhalation. As night settles deeper and the stars grow soft above the horizon, the world returns to its first quiet. The air cools, the fire fades. The echo becomes a hum, gentle, steady, endless. You can rest now. The mountains are still watching. The wind is still whispering. And somewhere, in the invisible spaces between atoms, between breaths, between dreams, the Denisovans are still here. Their song woven into the pulse of the living world. Not gone, not forgotten, only transformed into the silence that endures. The echo still lingers,